Fred, you and others have forcefully advocated for the importance of fully integrating young people of all ages into the multi-generational life of the church. And that one of the most fruitful generative places for that to happen is by participating in the multi-generational worship. And I can imagine good youth ministers who read your work and hear exhortation saying, yep, we're going to bring the kids into Sunday morning 9:30 service. And I can imagine the senior minister convicted by your work saying, I need to make sure those young people are here in this worship. But that form of worship, particularly in mainline congregations, is a work in progress that reflects all the conservatism and resistances of folks who've been worshiping that way for a long time, who have a vision of worship that doesn't create space for young people leadership, whose music form doesn't necessarily speak to the kids, and whose sermons rarely include references to adolescent life or what's going on at school or what's going on in a pop culture, that the senior minister's working pretty hard but just isn't watching Dawson's Creek at night and doesn't have the ready available cultural references. I realize I'm dating myself.
Yeah, you and me both.
So what is your advice to the senior pastor or the youth minister who wants to integrate young people into the life of the congregational worship but only has a certain room for maneuver in evolving that worship?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an enormous question that we could talk about for hours. Let's acknowledge that worship is a contested zone, Christian worship, that not all agree about. Even in a single congregation, you would have 100 different opinions about what represents good or authentic Christian worship. That's out there. And what you have said is certainly true, that liturgy is a conserving practice. It evolves slowly, if at all. And then there is this experience of kind of bifurcated ministry where youth often are brought up in a worshiping tradition that welcomes their guitar hero ambitions as opposed to Sunday morning with the pipe organ and them sitting still and being quiet. So my project isn't just a youth ministry project. It necessarily is a congregational project. And all practical theology is contextual. And I operate out of the sensibility that young people exit high school, Christian young people exit high school without a robust enough sense of Christian identity. And I think that one of the untapped resources is a robustly enacted liturgical life, so that sacramentally, for example, we don't just hear the stories of God's history of salvation, of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, of the Spirit's journey with the church. We enact them. We enact Jesus' death and life at Eucharist. In baptism, where we use more than a milliliter of water, we enact plunging into the tomb. We go down into the tomb and die Jesus' death, and then we rise up out of it, sharing in the hope of his resurrection. This is Paul's language. So my sense is that whether one is highly sacramental or not, that these sorts of practices are critical for getting the stories of the faith into our bones. That said, there's all kinds of space for cultural interpretation. You can do this kind of worship singing Fanny Crosby hymns, or you can do it with 8 15-year-olds strumming their guitars. And we need that breadth. As much as it ticks us off at times, I got to a point where I was very tired of Fanny and me having to get washed in the blood. And the bass lines are fun to sing because they're all the same note, but that just wore on me after a while. And yet I need Fanny Crosby. So let's take this into, let's stop talking about Fanny. adults in a congregation need the passion and the desire to praise that young people can bring to the assembly. Young people need the enactment into the stories of the faith that robust liturgical worship can bring them. And liturgical doesn't mean monks mumbling monotones. It can fully incorporate their joy, their praise, their doxology. But we all need each other. We live in a culture that says, no, you don't. You know, we're all self-constructed. I could be the Church of Fred, everything be great. But that's not the gospel. The gospel is that we're created as dependent upon, first of all, the triune God, and also dependent upon one another, and that we become fully human through that interdependence. So maybe I'm just whistling in the wind, but I think that worship is a place where that reality can be enacted, where at times, despite our differences, the kingdom can break in. Whatever kind of worship we end up with in a local community, better that it involve young people than not. And it may be more critical, their involvement, their leadership, whether it's singing or guitar or testifying, whatever practice, their involvement and the kind of formative impact of that involvement is liable to have more of an impression on them, make more of a mark on them than the particular theologizing that's going on around them. Though, of course, I would want that theologizing to be triune, to be robustly sacramental, that is, fully engaged bodies, and corporate. Now, we're short of Jesus coming back, we're not going to get all the way there. But somebody, you know, I feel like somebody like me ought to be out there standing up saying, hey, this is what worship should look like. Knowing full well that I don't have it figured out by any means, and that in some ways I'm failing to see and acknowledge other liturgical forms that are equally formative and full of the Spirit. But nevertheless, this is the space. This is the space where God promises to show up, and we all need to get there. And worship isn't just to give us the peaceful, easy feeling. It's supposed to mess with us, you know? It's supposed to trouble us as well. And if I could say one more thing about this, the way that I find that is in the theology of Gordon Lathrop or Don Salyers and some other liturgical theologians who work with the notion of juxtaposition, that our praise is juxtaposed to necessarily to our lament, that the ethos of God is juxtaposed to the pathos of humanity. And it's in these clashes that aren't always comfortable, but that's where God breaks in and shakes things up. So I'm actually hopeful about this, in that young people at the Youth Academy, for example, they're very polite their first couple days there, and they'll say, Dr. Edie, are we going to worship like this every night? And the implication is, dude, what are you doing? You know, we're singing, we're reading rote prayers, and we're bowing, and by the end of the 2 weeks, this is the space, and no other space can quite equal it, where they are profoundly aware of the powerful, loving presence of God. So they're kind of open to going with this, and so I think maybe that's a good reason for starting with them, because they'll grow up in it, and then we'll need to think about some new possibility that we haven't thought of. But for now, it seems to me a helpful thing to imagine